So I'm Martin Sadler. I'm a CIO in the NHS. The I stands for informatics, which is one of those made-up words that doesn't mean anything. But in the past, it used to mean that you ran all the technology, but you also ran all the data processing and all the getting the right information about what's happening with your patient flow out of the systems that you support. Now, fortunately, I don't manage getting the data out. My view, and I've been a CIO in the council, I've been a CIO in retail, in fast fashion, online stuff, and as far as possible, I'm trying to make sure that whatever data is in the system that turns into information has nothing to do with me at all. I am really, really interested, and Julie and I go back a long time, and we have some great discussions about why I should just keep my hands off data because I know nothing about it. I'm in total agreement with that, unlike a lot of CIOs. And one of your challenges in terms of getting data is sometimes wrestling your permissions and your support from the CIO. So I'm going to run through a few stories that I've had where I've basically been tripped over by information, and I've actually had to manage that, and then some other tips. Feel free to ask questions at the end, but I'll apologise first for next slide. So this we've been working remotely for the last 3 months in the NHS. Obviously, we've been at the hub of having to get people to work from home, encourage people to use video conferencing, try and see patients remotely without seeing patients. On top of there's been a lot of poorly people, and it's all been not a very nice experience. But I end up most days having done about 7 teleconferences, and just reminding it, when you hit my age, you remember the Muppet Show, and I just look at teams and teams of people who are all hoping to try and talk at the same time, and this image just is the one that burns into my brain as I go to sleep. So apologies if you've got video conferencing fatigue, but this is hopefully a little bit of a refresher from that. So in terms of, you decide which one you are yourself, for those of you who know them. So I stand here as your natural enemy. My job as a CIO is to prevent anybody from doing any useful work whatsoever. So if you're asking for access to certain data and my team don't want to share that, actually, just turn lights on and off, we'll basically try and prevent. Work prevention teams is what you might experience the general CIO, or you can't access something because somebody somewhere decided that it's just too much hard work for us. So there's a really significant point here that says, how do I, who want to understand data, encourage the CIO that actually the data isn't theirs. The data's something that they just look after and make sure they look after well. So we have a lot of data flowing through the hospital. We have some daily reports, and we get new requests for reports every day about how many people who wear spectacles are susceptible to getting the COVID compared to people who wear contact lenses, and all sorts of weird stuff that comes out of it. And a lot of times they ask me for that information. Fortunately, I have a really good information team who sits somewhere else and don't report to me, and we as the trust look after them, and they're the people who get that information, and then they'll ask me for access to another bit of space or a server. But it is a real problem for some people. Conversely, there's also a problem where in other organisations I've sat in, people think that I do own all the data, so I am the data processing authority for whatever their system is, because they don't want to own it. So a lot of the times when I get audited and when people come and talk to me, they say, you own everything, you're responsible for everything that goes on in emails. Patently, I'm not responsible for every email and the content of emails. However, when you're trying to pin information onto something, when you've got your silos and the people of that world. They need to pin it on somebody. So I developed a few years ago a really, really handy tip for this. Right? I was working with an HR director who refused to be accountable for all the information in the HR database, and said that because it was a database and because it was in IT, that the CIO was ultimately accountable for everything that went on in the HR database. So I used my normal rationale to say I don't think it is, because I don't really care about the HR database, and the conclusion that I lost that battle at the time, which is why I have a battle up there, was that actually I was accountable for everything in the HR database. So being a CIO and having a proper robust change management process, I raised a change to turn it off. I invited the head of HR to the change meeting because I told him it was for information only, and he didn't have a say in the matter because it was my system and not his system. And at that point, he got a bit upset because he didn't think he'd be able to run his service without a HR database. At that point, the change turned from a let's not turn this system off, let's change the ownership of it to the HR director. Now, that might seem a bit of a weird way around it, but in my view, it was a sensible way around it, and it was the best way to persuade the person that the ownership of that was in the right place. And I think one of the key things in loads of organisations is understanding the difference between the owner of data and the manager of the box that the data sits in. So if you are having that problem in your organisation, I'll quite happily give you some steer or even persuade your CIO that there's a point where you want to be a bit lazier and you don't have to control everything. Especially you don't have to control everything just because people think you do. So the next story, one of the first things, I went to work at a council, and at a council obviously you're looking at half a million people. And one of the things that one of the earliest conversations I had was an irate member of the public who had been sent a council tax bill for 5 pence. We decided that in all the changes that went through and the recalculations one year that we would have to send everyone an additional bill to fill up a shortfall, and the way the mathematics worked out was this one gentleman had been sent a paper letter with a 40p stamp on it, in an envelope, a request that he pay us 5p. So being irate, he got on the bus, came to the council offices, asked to speak to the head of IT, because obviously this is an IT thing. If we send 5 pence out, bills out to people, and that sort of took me on my first ever big journey of data. I went and agreed that it was a ridiculous thing to do, and I offered to look into it. And I then went into this journey that took me into counting maths or counting rates. How does a calculation work, and how do we get down to a system that decided to produce a bill for more money than it would cost to receive in revenue? And at that point, I came across the person in charge of housing revenue who said, "Well, they owe me 5p, so I want that 5p." And so not only do you have a technology problem, you get that the people problem that came through. At that point, I gave them 5p and just said, "Please don't send this person any more letters. And please change your system so that it doesn't do that for this individual, and maybe consider the cost to the organisation of you sending out a 5 pence thing, just because that's what your information tells you." And at that point, I then decided to go to the post room and start charging the revenues people 50p for every letter they sent out, which was the thing that did it in the end, because they were actually feeling the cost. But one of the problems you get in big organisations, and I've worked in big and little organisations, is in big organisations, the accountability is the trouble. It's not getting the data out of the systems, it's getting people to understand that they own the data. So I can't look at a 5p piece in the same way. Now, we're all in a life, I'm not sure how many of you are on Strava, but we're all in a life of online data, and our data is collected from everywhere. I noticed Google tracks me. I have no problem with Google tracking me. It tells me where I went last week, and it tells me where I went last year, and it tells me also where I've been in the last 2 months, and the answer is my house and work and the occasional trip to the supermarket. But along a couple of years ago, Strava produced this global map of everybody who tracked their bike rides, their walks, and their running around whichever bits they ran round. And what you'll see is that it's highly used in America, it's highly used in Europe, and Europe's very well populated. But what they hadn't anticipated was that actually there are a lot of Americans who were working in Afghanistan at the time, and Afghanistan's one of those countries around there. And actually, if you zoomed into some of these places that are hot and that they weren't expecting to be hot, you can actually identify an American army base based on where the people using Strava had been for their patrols or been for their runs. And I think there's a point which I use to illustrate is that there is a lot of data out there, and not only is it our job to get information and understanding and therefore make decisions based on the data, but it's also useful to understand that if we are going to share that data, what that data is going to be used for. Now, closer at home, for those of you who've got really expensive bicycles, you may notice that if you do record your bike ride from home back to home or home to work and back, there are people out there who cleverly look at who's got the best speeds, who compete against each other, who want to record their own personal bests. Very likely to have the best bike, and therefore putting home into your Strava or any other location tracking events and moving really fast basically identifies you to have a good bike and therefore likely to be stolen. But one of the nice things about this is the profusion of public data, and the data that anyone can see is it makes it so much more convenient and so much simpler for criminals to engage in criminal activity. And one of the areas that I have worked in is I worked for an identity security company in Sweden, which was quite exciting, and we were really, really keen on how much data we could find out about other people and what their activities and what their movements were. And then when you apply that into other areas, which is the whole point of us using computers to the best of our ability, then we get to do some really exciting things. And one of the things I did for an online fast fashion company was to open a shop. So we went from bricks to bricks. So we opened the shop, and one of the things that we could do on the app that we gave to our loyal online customers, that we could track their location. So in the point of being able to track where your customers were, we could see, and IKEA did this as well, we could see that they were near where our outlet was. So we could see that, they were within 200 meters of our shop. At that point, we can send them a message because we know that they shop with us. We know that they're near our only outlet at the time, which was in London. We can send them a message that's targeted to them that says, if you get to our shop in the next 10 minutes, you can have 10% off whatever you want to buy. Now, there are other retailers out there who use the same technology, who found out that if you were within 5 meters of a competitor's shop, that they could send you a message saying, don't go in there, come to our shop because you can have a percentage off. And what they found when they trialed this in America, it was disrupting the flow of customers through shopping malls, and people were going into almost getting into a shop and turning around immediately because they'd got a message on their phone, and that meant they weren't entering shops. So that technology actually, while it's a lovely thing and it's a really good example of turning data into information to make your organisation successful, and unfortunately wasn't really allowed to go forward because the other tenants of the building were complaining about the tenant using the technology. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And what IKEA do is IKEA track what you spend, what you look at online, and then if you do visit the store, they'll tell you you are standing 10 meters away from the thing that you were looking at 2 weeks ago. But we all know that if you're 10 meters away from something in IKEA, it's actually half an hour's walk. But tracking all of that information of where people are going to is really the bit of help that, from my point of view as a CIO, I would quite happily give you all that information and then develop something for you. And while I'm interested in what you do with it, my view as the CIO is that I'll just put up the Wi-Fi and let you do whatever you need to do with that. And part of the reason I do my job is so that people like you can do the exciting things with that. Now, what you've also got to remember is, as the CIO, it will be fantastic for me to have a big shiny data warehouse and be really caring about all of your information, your data sources and your data. But I think I've got an image for you here of behind your lovely database and your lovely storage, this could be where it's all held. So I went to work at one organisation, which I really probably shouldn't mention, and all of the critical information for that organisation was flowing through this data centre. And this, we didn't pull the panels up for the photograph. This was in my first week in the organisation, trying to find out what was going on, and was the quality of the care that we gave to the systems that we were looking after. So while it'd be lovely to think that your CIO and your IT department are on your side, it may be that they're all stacked out. I went the next week to show somebody round that, and I wasn't allowed into the data center because there had been a rat in there, and we were waiting for the rat man to come and get it. So it's not as bad as the friend of mine who had squirrels in his data center, but that's because it was leafy green and the squirrels actually used it. The rat went, we got rid of the rat, and actually we improved the data center, is what you need to know. And the next interesting data lesson that I had was I did a procurement exercise for a council, and what we tried to do was we tried to write to all of our suppliers and tell them that if they didn't raise purchase orders, then we wouldn't be able to pay them very quickly, and actually they should quote the purchase order if they're a supplier. And one of the, so going to a council and get a list of suppliers and write a standard letter that just politely says, we'll pay you much more quickly if you quote the purchase order number and just send the letter out. No questions asked. Now at the time it was my name on the bottom of the letter because I was running some procurement department for some reason. I think it's because I fixed the IT department, I had nothing else to do. And I got a phone call from somebody who said two things. One of the things that councils and big organisations are really good at is writing to dead people. And writing to dead people is not a very nice thing, but it basically just shows you the quality of the data and the quality of the information you turn that data into, and that your systems don't talk to each other. So what had happened was I got a phone call from this lady saying, you've sent a letter to my mother, and she passed away, and we thought we'd told the council that she had passed away, but obviously she hadn't. And the other thing is, I don't think she was ever a supplier to the council, so I was wondering how you got her information and put her on this list. So then what I had to do was I had to backtrack through this big amount of different systems, and the journey was, how did she get on the list? She was a supplier. What did she supply to us? Well, she didn't actually supply anything to us. So why was she a supplier? Well, we walked into, why was she set up as a supplier? Well, she was set up as a supplier because we gave her a parking ticket erroneously, because she actually was allowed to park where she parked. And because she was allowed to park where she parked, the parking department had to then refund the money to her. But at the time, they couldn't refund the money to her because there wasn't the process for that. So they decided that the best way to refund the money to this woman was to set her up as a supplier and to pay her the amount of money that the parking fine was for. So there's a lesson that I learned then was, one, don't trust the information that you're getting out of your systems, and don't send letters to 7,000 people thinking you get it right. But the other one was, you might be working in an organisation where people are very protective about the information that they're holding that allows them to do their jobs, and you might get it completely wrong. Now, I've got one last thing, because this is just about the final story is about how do we then get people to change the way they think. So this one is was one of my favourite ones, where we booked a knife thrower to appear in a town centre for some shoppers' entertainment the week after there'd been a stabbing in the same town centre, and about how do we persuade people that we're on their side. So what we did was we approached the knife thrower and said, there's just been a stabbing last week, it's not appropriate to have a knife throwing action in the town centre for the shoppers. Could you throw something else instead? They said, well, we could, but it's not quite as exciting. And I think the message you get is, there's a thought process that says, just because your bit of data didn't work, didn't get the right amount of information for you, doesn't mean you should abandon the whole thing and change what you do. I think the lesson that I learned from it is, you don't change what you do is you change what the process is and what the people's behaviours are, and you get to the point that proves that the quality of data will only improve if you trust the people that are managing the data, you give the ownership of the data to the right people, and you get your CIO to recognise that actually we'd like our data to be available whenever we need it, we'd like it to be robust, we'd like it to be backed up, and where possible, and this is where the CIO comes in, we'd like you to give us the things that we need to do in order that we can link one piece of data to another piece of data, so that the information that we can get out there is rich. The challenge you've now got is to get data ownership away from your CIO and get your CIO to realise that without the data, the rest of your business can't work, and that anybody can deliver a server and a laptop and the technology bit, which is the easy bit. And the last bit is, if it doesn't work, just blame IT. That's what I've been doing for the last 20 years on the back end. So that's my overview. I'm sure you've got a lot of experience of that you might like to ask some questions about, and I'll turn you back over to Julian now to see what those are. Thanks, Julian.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So yes, always useful to get some of your war stories because you do seem to have an interesting life. So yes, just a quick reminder to everyone, if you type your questions into the questions panel, then I can ask them on your behalf and curate them into some kind of logical order. So first one's worth posing to Martin is from Tim King. So he's just interested in your thoughts about the Chief Data Officer role and what experience you have of working in organisations that have got both a CIO and a CDO.
Right, I'm all for the Chief Data Officer role. Absolutely, you need somebody with the ability to see what data can do. The CIO has never been trained to do that. Most CIOs have come to either they know how to complete a program, or they know how to run a server, or they know how to run a help desk, and they have got no expertise beyond that, and therefore where I've seen businesses successful is they know what's going on in the business, and they know what's going on in the business because they know about the user experience and the quality of the data going in. Everyone should have a data scientist, a chief data officer that just drills down into it. And I think there's a really important point that the CDO and the CIO have to have a working relationship and have to get on with each other, and that's not always easy because mainly because of my peers. I'd say from my experience, not wanting to let go. But yeah, if you're in a big organisation and you haven't got someone who manages your data, then your organisation isn't going to be successful.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. So, sort of related to that, a question I'd got written down was really, do you think that the title CIO, Chief Information Officer, actually should be abandoned? Because actually, most of them are actually fulfilling a Chief Technology Officer role. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there came a point about 15 years ago when everybody wanted to be called a chief something or other. For some reason, it was probably to do with you get more money if you're a CIO than if you're a head of IT. I was always happy to be the head of IT in charge of the tools and the services that you give to your end users. The Chief Information Officer is a misnomer because you're not in charge of the information. You're right, it should be a Chief Technology Officer would be more suitable, but there was a survey done 2 years ago that CIOs got paid more than CTOs if they were permanent, and CTOs got paid more than CIOs if they were contractors. So it all comes down to, well, I'm a CIO and I've worked really hard to get this badge, so I'll do it because one, I get more money, and two, there's some kudos about being the CIO club, and not something I personally adhere to. But yeah, the information bit and the informatics bits, I think, needs to be removed from the title unless you manage both, and then you would have a CTO and a CDO reporting to the CIO.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So a question from Jan Heslop. So how do you demonstrate that your data is accurate and in alignment with other NHS trust data?
Yeah, that's really good. One of the problems we have, most people assume that the GP is information. So you've got primary care, which is your GP, and secondary care, which is your trust, and I work in a trust which actually has a bit of primary care. And we have, everyone has an NHS number. And we have the same problem as most people do, is that if you assume that everything the GP knows about you is known to the trust and vice versa, you'll be surprised that it's not, because of the sharing. So what we have to do is we have to cross-reference the youth centre as a person whose NHS is. It is actually quite simple because the NHS number is the NHS number. But what you'll find is your NHS number with your GP might be different to the one registered to a different address, the same number, different address. So what we do is we always go back to what's your NHS number, and that's your number for life, and we just pin it on that. It's as more computer systems come online and get improved, it's becoming less and less common that we send the wrong details out to the wrong person. So we just use that one number, and we make sure that all the systems that we introduce reference that one number. That's how we did it. It's nearly effective, but that number never changes.
Yep. Okay, so it's all about identifiers being key, which is actually the case in virtually every business or organizational context. There was a question from one person about feedback for the webinar. So just a quick reminder, we're using the Fun Retro board to capture insights and also questions and topics for the panel debate on Friday. So if you've got some more general comments, please use the Fun Retro board in there. The link was in the chat box. Next question has come from Emmanuel Ude, who's been very diligent and sort of been on all the webinars and asked good, intelligent questions on each one so far. So I think brownie point there for Emmanuel. He's enjoying your stories and particularly focus on data science, analytics, and the fancy stuff. He's interested about what you have to say about data management, how you think we can make sure there is more focus on this in the focus on data management generally.
So the way I'd approach it is I'd approach the CIO with a shopping list, and I'd ask the following questions. I'd ask, how many places is my data stored? So that's the first thing, because, you know, when was it last backed up? So that's your second question you ask. And the third question you ask is, when did you last restore from a backup to prove that it's robust? So you need to be asking those questions. And most CIOs don't want to be asked those questions because where's it stored? Well, it's stored in a little box in the corner just by that panel. So when was it last backed up? Oh, I didn't realise you wanted to be backed up. And have you ever restored from backup? Most people haven't. They'll back it up and they'll back it up and they'll back it up. And then in 4 months' time, when you realise that your data's got a bit of a flaw, they can't recover it back to your last known details. So it comes back to that relationship, but if you treat your IT department as delivering you a service, you treat it like your car. When was your car last serviced? Yeah, and where's the spare key for the car if I lose my key? They're the ways you start on the journey. The next bit is when they tell you the answers, the response is going to be, okay, how do we work on making sure that this is better? Not, oh my goodness, you're not doing your job, this is terrible, and the world's about to end. The world's not about to end. We run systems that haven't been backed up for 7 years, and they've never failed. Yeah, we are getting them into backups now, but it's about the likelihood and the impact. I worked for a Goldfish Bank in one data center. You'd be surprised the first online bank only had one data center, but they said, well, the likelihood of us losing the data center and the damage that would do doesn't justify the cost of having 2 data centers. So there's a practical thing. But ask those questions of your IT department and then start the journey from where the answers take you to.
Yeah, good, thank you. So just a quick reminder, so if you do have questions to ask, it looks like the chat box has not been enabled, so I've put the links to Fun Retro in the question panel, so hopefully everybody can see those. So if you do have questions, please add your questions to the list. Next one that's just worth one from me is just your thoughts about grey IT, inverted commas. So all those wonderful Excel spreadsheets that people can do, or people who they've got a corporate credit card and they can go off and get an Amazon Web Service account set up and start putting data in there. What are your thoughts there about that anarchy?
I've always felt that access to databases are more of a problem than spreadsheets. I absolutely love a spreadsheet. So grey IT, shadow IT comes up a lot, and I think my principles are, you've got the person who's trying to do the service knows knows that they've got to do the service, and if they will go to somewhere else if they're frustrated. So they'll go and buy some storage space if they're frustrated with their IT department. And the IT department shouldn't ban it; they should understand that that's the situation, and then support the person going out to get something else. Also, IT, chief informatics officers, heads of IT need to accept that there is now competition. Somebody can just buy 40 quid's worth of processing power from Amazon a month and actually do something far quicker than if you get an internal charge for a bigger internal charge. And the way of doing that, the IT's got to embrace it. Now, my principle is, so we do get asked to buy new systems, and we have 3 rules. First, it must be platform independent. So whatever we buy shouldn't dictate the operating system, or say it only works on Windows 10 or it only works on a Chrome browser. So that's first thing, platform independent. The second thing is it should be web-based, which means I can see the output anywhere, from working from home, from my laptop at work, from my mobile phone. And the third thing should be it links to my other system. So if you are going out and saying, I want to be able to do some processing on a spreadsheet that's held on AWS, then make sure it's secure, but also talk to the IT department, say, I need to be able to extract this data on there, put that back. And I like shadow IT for another reason, because it doesn't show up my budget, someone else's budget. And one of the things that IT directors get asked a lot is to reduce their budget. But shadow IT should remain a shadow IT, but the IT department should be aware of it, and they should help you do that. And that's why most of my peers think I'm an idiot, because they think I should try and do it. But I am aspirationally idle and don't like unnecessary work, especially if we go back again, the data scientists and the chief data officer know what they're trying to do. And if someone else is providing the computing power, then let them.
Yeah, fair enough. So again, talking about Chief, Tracy Ingward has asked a question really about the relationship with Chief Digital Officer. So it's another chief role, another use of the D, but rather than data, this is digital. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, digital's one of those things that came out, wasn't it, that said, we won't call you a CIO, we'll call you a Chief Digital Officer. And again, it's a title. I'm not sure there's a distinction. Some people became Chief Digital Officers because they just changed their title. They didn't change anything else about their opportunities. I think it's a useful thing to have that says, actually, let's try and move everything to be a digital thing, and it's just as good a name as being a CIO, and it's just as bad a name. But at least Chief Digital Officer says I'm issuing mobile phones to people as well.
Yeah, fair enough. What about thoughts though in terms of both the grey IT and the slightly less regulated approach from a GDPR perspective, particularly if there's any potentially personally identifiable information that may be either stored in strange places or leaking out of the organisation?
Yeah, and that comes back to that point about who owns the information. There's definitely a lot of the GDPR activities are about user behaviour and about how do we train users what to do that. I mean, I oversaw an investigation in why we found 10,000 ballot papers in a skip. And so it doesn't, it's not just IT that leaks information, it's just that when IT leaks information, it can be used really, really quickly and really, really effectively to share, and it's a bigger problem. But the number of times a social worker left a case notes at the wrong location, or his case notes on the top of the car, were as often as somebody sent an email to the wrong person. The problem you have with technology is it's really, really easy now to send your data, to lose your data, to send it to the wrong place, and to leave it in the wrong place. So I think the GDPR aspects, coming back to the cloud as well, are really important. And while while I wouldn't want to own the data, I do support everybody in the organisation to make sure that they know what their GDPR exposure is and what they need to do to make sure they are within the regulations.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously key there is making sure that you're legal. Again, Tracy Angwerda, she's asked a couple of things really together. Is a point really is that the shadow IT is actually software as a service, and she's talking about MarTech, which I'm assuming marketing technology space is actually a well-developed ecosystem, but actually it's a minefield because of that customer data. And what about mastering that data, particularly if it's spread across too many sources and trying to get that single version of the truth, or at least a single view of the truth?
I think that's the point about making sure that you are aware of shadow IT, because the more you're trying to clamp down on it, the more it will happen, the more people will be doing stuff without talking to you. The worse service you deliver as an IT director, the more people will go off and do something else. So actually opening up and helping people do that allows you to then have the questions about, all right, well, what information is going over there, and how do we know, and what's the data processing agreement we've got with our organisation. So while we own all the contracts for all the IT suppliers, even if we don't manage them directly, but in line with those, we also make sure that we have had sight of the data processing agreements. And I think that's right and proper, because IT should be doing the boring stuff and you should be doing the exciting stuff. And checking the data processing agreement is robust is part of the boring essential stuff that we need to do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I think we're getting towards the end of the time. We've got one last question from Jan Heslop. So she's got an interesting one to explore. Of during the COVID crisis, what new data issues have been uncovered that you want to fix?
So the first issue we came out was a few of the Nightingale hospitals were sending patients between hospitals, or we were all sending our patients or planning to send our patients to a hospital and actually not having a standard way of sending patient information because we didn't have one system was a bit problematic. So that was a sort of a highlight of we're not really quite sure how we're going to put this stuff together and whose system we're going to use, and everyone got parochial about which system we're going to use. But I think the biggest data problem that came to light was the disconnect between the health service and the social care service. So there was a lot of possibly avoidable situations where people were discharged from hospitals, from their GPs, and sent to care homes that maybe didn't need to be sent to care homes, and the care homes didn't have access to all the health records. So when we did the tests, and while the tests are only 80% effective on whether you have COVID or not initially, sharing that information, I think, would have been really useful, and that's I think it's brought to light the fact that we need to share that information in a much quicker way. So that's the biggest learning point, was about cross-functional sharing. But then you're not just sharing it between the council, you're sharing it to the private sector as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's probably a need for some standard methods and standard formats for doing that transfer. So not trying to say everybody must use the same configuration of the same software, but actually at least having standard neutral formats for doing the transfer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Okay, right. So I think we've got to the end of the questions there, and we're approaching the end of the time. So actually, there is one more question. We'll do one more, and then we'll wrap up. But then, so this is about improving the clinical information with social care. So this is actually building what you're saying there. Is you've got two views of an individual. How can we potentially work on improving the quality of that information?
So the first thing I think you've got to do is you've got to have an explicit thing that says the person who the information is about needs to be aware that their information is being shared. And actually, most people would expect that. So they expect that in the NHS itself that the people looking after me have all got the same information, and that is how it should be and how it isn't. But that's the thing that stops us sharing. And I think the way to improve that is to have sharing on 2 levels. So the first level should be, these are the things that you might want to be aware of without giving information that's identifiable. So we'll send something out to the social worker saying, before you visit this person, make sure that you've asked the following questions. So ask these questions about, have they had a coronavirus check? Are they living alone, or whatever those questions are? And then when you've got that next level of agreement, then share that information. So I think there's something really key about allowing the individual to easily share the information. You give the individual their social care information and their health record information, and allow them to give the sharing permissions to the person who's looking after them, rather than expect me to have a sharing agreement. Because I could have a sharing agreement with 1 care home, but I've got 60 care homes, so I now need 60 sharing agreements. Where if you put the individual sharing agreement down to the individual, then they can say, I want my doctor, and I want my social worker, and I want my bank to be able to see all this information. So there's something about, and I know they're doing some work on this in Scotland, and I know they're doing some work on this in the Nordic countries, about giving you personal information to the individual and allowing them to share that. But I think that would really be helpful, because you don't need to share all the information. It's not a blanket thing, it's just the critical bits of information that are owned by the individual. That's too radical for most people. I've had that conversation too many times.
Yeah, I think there's also a capability case for certain individuals who are getting a bit older and what have you. But anyway, so I think that's been really insightful. So thank you for your time, Martin. Thank you for all your insights.